On the 15th of August 1945, Emperor Hirohito's voice crackled through radio speakers across Japan, announcing the unthinkable surrender. For the ultranationalists, who had spent decades building an ideology of divine destiny and racial supremacy, this was not merely defeat. It was the collapse of everything they believed in. Some chose death. War Minister Korechika Anami committed seppuku hours before the broadcast. Vice Admiral Takijie Trenishi, creator of the kamikaze program, followed him into oblivion. Across the empire, scores of officers and true believers took their own lives, rather than face a world without their sacred cause. But most did not die. And what happened to them? How men who had orchestrated wars of conquest, organized secret societies, and promoted emperor worship, transformed into the architects of post-war Japan, is one of the strangest political resurrections in modern history. Within weeks of Japan's formal surrender on the 2nd of September, 1945, General Douglas MacArthur's occupation forces began what they called democratization. At its heart was a systematic effort to remove the architects of Japanese militarism from public life. The scale was enormous. The Supreme Commander for the Allied Powers, SCAP, as MacArthur's administration was known, screened over 717,000 individuals. More than 200,000 were ultimately banned from holding public office. The targets included military officers, leaders of ultranationalist societies, members of the Imperial Rule Assistance Association, business executives involved in overseas expansion, and colonial governors. Organizations that had promoted Japanese imperialism were forcibly disbanded. The Black Ocean Society, the Genisha, which had terrorized opponents since 1881, was dissolved. The Black Dragon Society, the Kokuri Kai, which had run espionage networks across Asia and helped foment wars against Russia and China, was ordered to cease all activities in 1946. The Great Japan Patriotic Party, the various militarist youth leagues, the networks of ultranationalist thugs who had assassinated prime ministers and intimidated dissenters, all were officially dismantled. The occupation authorities drafted a new constitution, which Emperor Hirohito promulgated in 1947. Article 9 was its revolutionary heart. Japan would forever renounce war and never maintain military forces. The emperor was stripped of his divine status. He was now merely a symbol of the state. Universal suffrage was extended to women. Labor unions were legalized. The massive Zaibatsu conglomerates that had powered Japan's war machine were targeted for dissolution. For a brief moment, it appeared the occupation might achieve what seemed impossible: the complete transformation of Japanese society. Parallel to the purge came retribution. 1 week after Japan's surrender, MacArthur ordered the arrest of suspected war criminals, beginning with former Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. When American officers arrived at Tojo's home, he shot himself in the chest, but American doctors saved his life so he could face trial. 28 men were ultimately charged as class A war criminals, those accused of crimes against peace and conspiracy to wage aggressive war. The International Military Tribunal for the Far East convened in Tokyo in May 1946, in the same building where Tojo had once planned conquests. The trial lasted 2.5 years, more than twice as long as Nuremberg. On the 4th of November 1948, all surviving defendants were found guilty. 7 were sentenced to death by hanging, including Tojo, General Iwin Matsui, who had presided over the rape of Nanking, and General Haitaro Kimura, who had brutalized Allied prisoners. On the 23rd of December 1948, the 7 condemned men were executed at Shigemo prison. Their bodies were cremated, and an American major personally scattered their ashes from a plane over the Pacific Ocean, 30 miles east of Yokohama. The occupation authorities wanted no martyrs' shrines. Separate tribunals convicted over 5,500 additional Class B and Class C war criminals, those guilty of conventional atrocities and crimes against humanity. Over 900 were executed, but the trials were controversial from the start. Critics noted that all 11 judges came from nations that had fought Japan. Indian Justice Radhabinod Pal issued a 1,200-page dissent arguing every defendant should be acquitted. If crimes against humanity were being prosecuted, Pal asked, why weren't the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki on trial? Most controversially, Emperor Hirohito himself was never charged. MacArthur made a calculated decision. Keeping the emperor on his throne would make occupation easier. Behind closed doors, South Carolina AP officials worked to ensure that testimony at the Tokyo trials deflected all blame onto Tojo and the military, leaving Hirohito untouched. The emperor who had approved the attack on Pearl Harbor would die peacefully in 1989. The longest reigning monarch in Japanese history. The reverse course. By 1947, the world had changed. The Cold War was beginning. Communist forces were winning China's civil war. The Soviet Union had absorbed Eastern Europe, and suddenly, America's priorities in Japan shifted dramatically. What historians call the reverse course began in 1947 and accelerated through 1950. The emphasis moved from democratization to economic rehabilitation, and from punishing militarists to building an anti-communist bulwark in Asia. The implications were profound. Plans to break up 325 major corporations were abandoned. Only 11 zaibatsu were actually dissolved. The newly empowered labor unions found their right to strike suddenly restricted. And most significantly, the purge began running in reverse. Thousands of purged nationalists and war criminals were quietly dirged and allowed to return to public life. Of the 80 class of war criminal suspects held at Shigamo prison, only 28 had been tried. The remaining 52, including men who had run the puppet state of Manchukuo and overseen slave labor operations, were released without ever facing trial. Among those released in 1948 was a man named Nobusuke Kishi. The monster of Shiwa. Nobusuke Kishi's biography reads like a dark mirror of 20th century Japan. In the 1930s, he had been the economic overlord of Manchukuo, Japan's puppet state in northeastern China. There, he earned the nickname, the monster of the Shoitwa era, for his ruthless exploitation of Chinese labor. He signed decrees authorizing the use of slave workers. At the Fushun coal mine alone, 25,000 of 40,000 workers had to be replaced every year. Their predecessors had died from brutal conditions. In 1941, Kishi served in Prime Minister Tojo's cabinet. As Minister of Commerce and Industry, he co-signed Japan's declaration of war against the United States. He spent the war years squeezing every resource from Japan's conquered territories. After surrender, Kishi was arrested as a class, a war criminal suspect, and held at Shigamo prison for 3 years. But he was never charged. In December 1948, the same month Tojo was hanged, Kishi walked free. The Cold War had transformed him from war criminal to valuable asset. The American occupation authorities saw in Kishi exactly what they needed, a fiercely anti-communist conservative, with the administrative skills to rebuild Japan as a Western ally. In 1952, when the occupation ended and purged politicians regained their rights, Kishi immediately won election to the National Diet. With covert CIA funding and encouragement, he helped engineer the 1955 merger of Japan's conservative parties into the Liberal Democratic Party, the LDPP. This 1955 system would dominate Japanese politics for the next 4 decades. In 1957, Nobusuke Kishi class, a war criminal suspect, architect of Manchukuo's slave economy, co-signer of the declaration of war against America, became Prime Minister of Japan. The fixer Kishi did not operate alone. Behind him stood one of the most extraordinary figures in post-war Japan, Yoshio Kodama. Kodama had been a violent ultranationalist since youth. Imprisoned multiple times for plots against politicians he deemed insufficiently patriotic. During the war, he ran the Kodama Agency, a smuggling operation that procured strategic materials for the Japanese Navy while enriching Kodama through opium trafficking. By 1945, he had amassed a fortune estimated at $175 million. Arrested as a class of war criminal, Kodama was held at Shigamo prison alongside Kishi. There, the two men formed a partnership that would reshape post-war Japan. The CIA secured Kodama's release in exchange for his services fighting communism. A 1953 CIA memo described him bluntly: a professional liar, gangster, charlatan, and outright thief, with no interest in anything but profits. The agency used him anyway. Kodama became Japan's most powerful Kuramaku black curtain, a behind-the-scenes fixer. Using his fortune and his extensive connections to the Yakuza, Japan's organized crime syndicates, he broke strikes, suppressed leftist movements, and funneled money to conservative politicians. When massive protests erupted against the 1960 US-Japan Security Treaty, Prime Minister Kishi turned to his old prison mate. Kodama organized a force of nearly 30,000 Yakuza gangsters and right-wing thugs to protect President Eisenhower's planned visit to Japan. The visit was ultimately cancelled due to the violence of the protests, and Kishi resigned in disgrace. But the pattern was set. For the next 2 decades, Kodama served as the invisible link between the Yakuza, the LDP, and American intelligence. His career finally collapsed in 1976, when he was exposed as the middleman in the Lockheed bribery scandal, which brought down Prime Minister Kekuhei Tanaka. A disillusioned ultranationalist actually crashed a small plane into Kodama's house. Kamikaze style, Kodama survived. But his power was broken. He died in 1984, taking many secrets with him. The last samurai, not all nationalists, accepted the compromises of men like Kishi and Kodama. Some remained true believers to the end. Yukio Mishima was Japan's most celebrated post-war author, nominated 3 times for the Nobel Prize. Internationally famous for novels like Confessions of a Masks and The Temple of the Golden Pavilion. He was also a bodybuilder, an actor, and an increasingly fervent ultranationalist. Mishima had been devastated by Japan's surrender and by Emperor Hirohito's renunciation of divine status. He believed post-war Japan had lost its soul, surrendering its warrior spirit for American-style consumerism. In 1968, he founded the Tatenokai, the Shield Society, a private militia of about 100 young men dedicated to restoring the emperor's divinity and Japan's martial traditions. On the 25th of November, 1970, Mishima put his beliefs into action. He and 4 Shield Society members entered the headquarters of Japan's self-defense forces in central Tokyo, supposedly for a scheduled meeting with the base commander. Once inside, they took the commander hostage and barricaded themselves in his office. Mishima stepped onto a balcony overlooking the assembled soldiers and delivered an impassioned speech. He called on them to rise up, overthrow the constitution, and restore the emperor. The soldiers jeered and laughed. After 7 minutes, Mishima gave up. "I can tell you are not rising up," he said. "I have lost my dream for the self-defense forces." "Well then, I will shout 'Long live the Emperor.'" He shouted the phrase 3 times, then retreated inside. There, at age 45, Yukio Mishima committed seppuku ritual suicide by disembowelment. A fellow Shield Society member attempted to behead him as tradition required. After 3 failed attempts, another member completed the task. Mishima's death shocked the world. No prominent Japanese had died by seppuku since the war's end. His final act was simultaneously a political protest, an artistic statement, and a rejection of everything post-war Japan had become. The long shadow, the story of Japan's nationalists, did not end with Mishima's dramatic suicide or Kodama's disgrace. The ideological currents they represented continued to flow through Japanese politics, sometimes underground, sometimes in plain sight. The Liberal Democratic Party that Kishi helped create has ruled Japan almost continuously since 1955. Within it, an ultranationalist faction has always existed, pushing to revise the pacifist constitution, restore patriotic education, and reframe Japan's wartime history in a more favorable light. In 1978, the Yasukuni Shrine, the Shinto memorial to Japan's war, dead quietly enshrined the spirits of 14 class of war criminals, including Tojo. Since then, Visits by Japanese prime ministers have provoked diplomatic crises with China and South Korea. In 1997, a new organization called Nippon Kaigi, the Japan Conference, emerged as Japan's largest ultranationalist lobbying group, with approximately 40,000 members, including numerous cabinet ministers and prime ministers. Nippon Kaigi advocates revising the constitution, promoting patriotic education, and rejecting what it calls the masochistic view of history that acknowledges Japanese wartime atrocities. The organization denies that comfort women were coerced and questions accounts of the Nanjing massacre. And the family dynasties endured. Nobusu Kishi's grandson, Shinzo Abe, served as Japan's longest tenured prime minister, from 2012 to 2020. Abe was a member of Nippon Kaigi. He visited Yasukuni Shrine. He worked to revise Japan's pacifist constitution. He described his grandfather as his #1 role model. When Abe was assassinated in July 2022, the killer's stated motive involved not Abe's politics, but his family's connections to the Unification Church, an organization that Kishi himself had brought to Japan as an anti-communist ally decades earlier. Even in death, the shadow of the monster of Shiwa stretched across generations. The unanswered questions, what does it mean that men responsible for aggressive war and mass atrocities became the architects of post-war Japanese democracy? That a system designed to prevent the recurrence of militarism was built, in part, by the militarists themselves. The Cold War provides an explanation, but not a justification. American priorities shifted from punishment to partnership. Class of war criminal suspects became valued anti-communist allies. The very skills that had made men like Kishi effective agents of empire, administrative competence, political ruthlessness, ideological commitment, made them useful in building the free world. Japan's remarkable post-war success, its economic miracle, its peaceful integration into the international community, its functioning democracy, owes something to these complicated figures. The stability of LDP rule, whatever its costs in corruption and complacency, prevented the political chaos that might have invited communist influence. But there were costs. The incomplete reckoning with wartime atrocities poisoned Japan's relations with its Asian neighbors for generations. The survival of ultranationalist ideology within the political mainstream meant that questions about the war, about comfort women, about the Nanjing massacre, about Unit 731's biological experiments, remained contested rather than settled, and the pattern of powerful men escaping accountability became woven into Japan's political culture. The nationalists of imperial Japan sought to create a divine empire that would last forever. They failed catastrophically, leaving tens of millions dead across Asia. Yet when the smoke cleared and the trials ended, many of them found their way back to power, their ideology muted but not extinguished, their networks intact, their families positioned to rule for generations. The old ultranationalist societies were dissolved, but their spirit proved harder to kill than any organization. In the black vans that cruise Tokyo today, blaring martial music and imperial slogans through loudspeakers, in the annual pilgrimages to Yasukuni, in the textbook controversies, and the constitutional revision debates, the heirs of the Black Dragon Society are still with us. They lost the war, but they survived to shape the peace.